community impact fee be reasonably related to the costs imposed on the municipality by hosting the marijuana establishment. Be capped at 3% of the total gross sales and encompass all financial obligations by the marijuana establishment to the host community. To ensure that these requirements are followed, this bill gives the Cannabis Control Commission explicit authority to review and approve host community agreements prior to a business obtaining provisional licensure. This ensures that prospective licensees do not sink time and capital only to be denied licensure for lack of valid host community agreement. Additionally, this bill recognizes the history of marijuana prohibition and enforcement and takes important steps to ensure that the marijuana industry in the Commonwealth is developed with social equity in mind. It creates a Cannabis Social Equity Trust Fund to encourage participation of businesses from communities disproportionately harmed by marijuana prohibition and enforcement by providing startup capital in the form of grants and loans, putting money directly in the hands of social equity business owners. The trust will be funded by an annual distribution of 10% of the Marijuana Regulation Fund, which amounts to about $18 million in fiscal year 23, to ensure that as the marijuana industry grows, so do social equity businesses. In addition to helping social equity businesses directly, this bill promotes the establishment of social equity businesses in municipalities by providing a financial incentive for municipalities to host social equity businesses by distributing 1% of the marijuana excise tax to the community that hosts them, and directing the CCC to develop policies for municipalities to promote participation in the marijuana industry by individuals from communities that have been disproportionately harmed by marijuana prohibition. As well as creating these new initiatives, this bill also makes needed technical fixes to provide statutory framework for a previously approved voter initiative to allow social consumption of marijuana. By clarifying the requirements of the host community agreements, making financial investments to increase social equity, and allowing for the full implementation of the cannabis industry through permitting social consumption authorization, I am confident that this legislation aids in the continued growth of a competitive and equitable commercial marijuana industry here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I would urge all of my members and my colleagues to please join me in voting yes on this bill.
For a statement, Chair will recognize the gentlelady from Suffolk, Ms. Jane Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to return the thanks and the acknowledgement to the gentleman who ably chairs our Ways and Means Committee for his work and his staff team's work on this bill over the last several weeks. Also want to extend thanks to the Senate President for paving the way for this bill to get to the floor today, as well as the many members of this body whose fingerprints are on this bill and whose originally filed legislation comprises this bill. Senator Jalen, Senator Collins, Senator DeZoglio, Senator Sear, Senator Moran, and my good friend, the senator from Springfield, who also has been a phenomenal champion in advancing this legislation. Also want to give thanks to my House co-chair, Rep. Donahue, and the staff of the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy for their hard work in advancing this legislation through committee and forming it together into this, into the sort of overall skeletal structure that we have before us today. And last but certainly not least, Mr. President, thanks are due and recognition is due to the many folks in the advocate community and in the industry who have pushed us to pay attention to this issue, shone a light both on the problems and on the solutions that we find in this bill today. Equitable Opportunities Now, BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, the CCC and its commissioners and staff, as well as former Commissioner Shailene Title, have to thank all of them for shining a light again on these problems and making sure that equity was prioritized every step of the way as we developed this legislation. Mr. President, in recent years, even in recent weeks, we in the Senate have taken steps to confront racial injustice in our state, most notably in our policing and criminal legal systems, in recognizing finally the holiday of Juneteenth and the rich heritage of Juneteenth in our state, and most recently, just last week, in advancing the Crown Act and recognizing the issue of hair discrimination in our state. Tackling our gaping racial wealth divide is the next front in this work toward pursuing racial justice in our state. Many of you are familiar with the Federal Reserve study that brought to light the fact that the average white family in Greater Boston's net worth is about $250,000, whereas the average net worth of a black family in Greater Boston is $8. It's not a typo. $250,000 compared to $8. This is a problem that cries out for redress in our state. We also see that we have huge disparities in our state in home ownership rates between white Bay Staters and Bay Staters of color. And we've seen how tragically these gaps in wealth have rippled through and transferred into gaps and disparities in the very health outcomes that Bay Staters have faced over the last 2 years of pandemic in our state. There's a direct line between the wealth gap and the disparities in COVID infection hospitalizations and deaths that we have seen in our state. So we know that if we are serious about the work of racial justice, we have to tackle this racial wealth divide. And that is why I'm so proud that we are taking up this bill today, because this bill is a racial wealth gap bill. 5 years ago, when this legislature passed our adult use cannabis law, we were the first in the nation to make an explicit commitment to equity in our adult use legal framework. It was a great thing and something we should all be proud of. When we passed that law, we made it explicit. Our goal was not just to legalize the cannabis industry, but to take steps to repair some of the harms caused by the destructive policies and practices during marijuana prohibition, wielded primarily against communities of color. For decades, Black and brown Bay Staters have borne the disproportionate toll of drug arrests and incarcerations. And so we saw in 2017 that we wanted to provide a pathway into this now legal industry for the people who had been harmed most by prohibition, people who have been traditionally left out or indeed locked up under those policies. Our intent was good, our focus was right, but so far, our reality has failed to live up to that promise. Today, social equity businesses make up only around 6% of cannabis licenses in our state, 6%. This despite the fact that Black and brown individuals make up over 30% of our state's population, with another 10% of individuals identifying as multiracial according to the 2020 census. The reasons for this, Mr. President, are clear, and they have been clear for several years now. If you talk to advocates, to policy experts, to the Cannabis Control Commission, you will find near universal agreement. They will tell you, Mr. President, that the costs of entry into the industry are too high and that there is a severe lack of access to capital in this industry. It typically requires $1 to $1.5 million in liquidity to open a new cannabis retail shop, or $3 to $5 million for a manufacturing facility. I don't know about you, Mr. President, but I don't have $1 million in liquidity. And I suspect probably very few, if any, members of this chamber have $1 million to $5 million in liquidity to open a new business. And even less is that the case for communities of color in our Commonwealth that have been disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition. And banks cannot offer business loans due to federal laws around cannabis. So when you need that kind of cash on hand in order to get into the business, in order to get your foot in the door, it's no surprise that despite our best intentions, the industry has remained predominantly white and predominantly in already wealthy hands. Let's take a moment to talk about some of the high startup costs in the industry. UMass Boston studied 460 host community agreements. And I want to give you a sampling of what they found. 40% of these agreements required the business to pay a donation to a local nonprofit, often with the town getting full control over where that money goes. Now, look, I'll be the first to say, charitable contributions are wonderful. I make them, you make them. I believe all businesses should make them to be good neighbors and good community members. But no other type of business is required to make charitable contributions as a condition that they be allowed to operate. One town created a community benefit payment, which is essentially the same thing as a community impact fee, but with another name. So on top of the impact fees that the business in that case were already required and that they were already charged, they were also required to pay another 2% of their revenue as a community benefit, separate from the community impact fee. Same thing, different name. Another town, on top of charging the business 3% of their revenue in community impact fees, charged them a $30,000 one-time fee for beautification and landscaping. Now, not all host communities, but many towns have stated their intention to use these fees as a piggy bank for all kinds of municipal spending, roads and water infrastructure, park upgrades, new police stations. And Mr. President, to be sure, municipalities, especially small towns across our Commonwealth, are up against very difficult math to meet their local obligations and responsibilities, to be sure. But it cannot be on the cannabis industry alone to solve that collective problem in our state. That is a responsibility we all share to solve. And we cannot put that solely on the backs of one industry in particular. That is not what we intended in the 2017 law. And in fact, we included in the 2017 law a 3% local excise tax exactly to fund these kinds of priorities, right? These kinds of general priorities. These extra payments on top of that 3% tax have nothing to do with the cost of operating a cannabis shop. They are a profoundly unfair burden to put on small businesses. And they mean, in practice, that multi-billionaire operators who can afford these types of extra payments will always have an advantage over equity shops. These inequities will not change unless we change them. And we put our dollars where our values are. So that brings us to the bill here today, which sets out to remedy both of these long-standing problems with long-identified solutions. Now, I want to provide a brief overview as to what this bill will do. To bring down entry costs, the host community agreement section of the bill clarifies and strengthens our legislative intent from 2017, ably constructed by the gentlelady from Somerville and negotiated by the gentleman from Belmont as well. At the request of the Cannabis Control Commission, the Supreme Judicial Court, and hundreds of small business owners and advocates across the state, we will clarify this legislative intent. It clarifies that the community impact fees, again, separate from the 3% excise tax that communities will still get, that the community impact fees must be related to the actual documented costs that a community incurs as a result of hosting a cannabis business, above and beyond what the community would incur from a similarly situated non-cannabis business, and that in no circumstance may this community impact fee exceed 3% of a business's annual gross revenue. And that going forward, HCAs will be reviewed and certified by the CCC to ensure that their terms are within the confines of the law. Now, to provide new access to capital, the other big problem that we need to address here, Massachusetts will establish a social equity trust fund, reclaiming our leadership position along with a handful of other states in the nation who are already performing this crucial investment in an equitable marketplace. As the Ways and Means Chair said, this loan fund will provide grants and loans to social equity applicants so that they can get a foot in the door. It will be funded by a 10% annual cut of the state's marijuana excise tax, totaling around a projected $15 to $18 million in the coming fiscal year. The bill also includes a technical correction regarding social consumption that clarifies, again, the legislative intent from 2017. As many will remember who were here in 2017, both the 2016 ballot initiative itself and the 2017 ballot passed by this legislature and signed into law by Governor Baker included a municipal referendum opt-in process for towns who wish to host social consumption sites. This bill will implement some technical corrections sought by the Secretary of the Commonwealth to expand the opt-in mechanisms to include local ordinances in addition to local referendum. This means there will finally be spaces for people who rent and who live in public housing to use legal products, often legally prescribed medicine, which is not the case today. And lastly, the bill incentivizes municipalities to prioritize equity. The bill directs the CCC to establish rules and regulations for municipalities to promote full participation by previously harmed communities, and importantly, it transfers an additional 1% of the excise tax that currently flows to the state over to municipalities for revenue generated within each social equity business that opens within their community. Mr. President, this bill brings to fruition the seeds that were in the original 2017 law. Our goal to steward equity in the new industry is the same as it was then, but in passing this bill today, we are recognizing that we have more work to do to make that goal a reality. And by advancing this goal, we are not just supporting racial equity in the cannabis industry forward going, we are also taking steps to repair historic harms. We are supporting wealth building in communities of color and taking steps to tackle our state's gaping racial wealth divide. Without this bill, that divide will continue to grow wider. I'm so proud to support this bill, Mr. President, which is another important step that the Senate is taking down the road of racial justice, and that we must continue to walk diligently and with urgency as a state. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Brief recess. Just to advise the members, we're waiting on some audio issues on the member line, or on the debate line rather. So we're taking a recess to resolve those. So that'll be in a brief recess. So that'll come to order. We're just testing audio. And I'll say a few more words about the subject of testing audio. Testing audio is important. And with that, we'll take a brief recess. So that'll be in order. It appears we're good to go. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Cape and Islands, Mr. Sear.
Up this legislation today. I want to thank my friend from Westport and his team for the tremendous work that got us here to this point, and certainly my friend and colleague from Jamaica Plain, who so eloquently laid out why the social equity elements as well as the technical corrections that are contained in this bill are absolutely so vital When we set out, 2 years, no, three actually, gosh, four plus years ago, in 2017, around taking up cannabis legislation after the voters had spoken, we really sought to have a cannabis industry that was equitable, that was diverse, and had ample avenues for entry for local entrepreneurship. And that is not what's happened here. And my friend from Jamaica Plain has done tremendous work to get us to this point, particularly in rectifying that. I also want to thank my colleague, my friend from Somerville, who drafted the original legislation on this and has been a force, and my friends from Boston and Methuen, and certainly want to thank our Senate President, for listening on this topic, and all the wonderful hard work, and especially Colby Dillon in the Senate President's office as well. So I'm going to speak briefly about two of the more technical provisions in the bill. The first, of course, being related to host community agreements. So in 2017, when we passed the recreational cannabis law, there were numerous provisions that were purposely included to ensure that smaller scale and POC-owned enterprises would have an entry point into this industry. And we've seen a number of barriers to that happening. But the significant inconsistencies that we see within these host community agreements have left, the same smaller scale enterprises, minority-owned businesses, vulnerable to astronomical and unforeseen costs that they just cannot pull together. And this inconsistency, I've seen this play out in my own district. So the Cape and Islands district has a whole spectrum of communities, from those who are a little hesitant around cannabis and haven't proceeded, to communities who are very eager to have it. And I'm actually going to just speak briefly. It's a tale not of two cities, but of two towns, of Provincetown and of Truro. And you can really see the inconsistencies in these host community agreements. And I'm picking on these communities in part because I live in these communities and they're my hometown. So in Provincetown, the town has executed actually 7 host community agreements to date. 7 host community agreements. I think folks know Provincetown is a place that many of us visit. And so you may not be surprised that Provincetown's eager to have cannabis establishments. The host community agreements that were executed were all pretty fair and reasonable. Certain accommodations around public safety concerns. Actually, the biggest concern among them primarily was around parking. When you've got a small town at the end of a peninsula, parking is always a headache. And so Provincetown executed 7 host community agreements they're quite fairly executed. Just down the road, Truro, my hometown, has been in the process of executing 2 host community agreements. One with actually one of the few craft cooperatives in the Commonwealth, the High June Cooperative, where they were able to make some progress there, and then more recently on a grow facility. And while the host community agreement actually was just signed, through that process, what the town of Truro was asking these cultivators to do was far beyond the scope of community impact. At one point in the negotiation, Truro was requesting that the owners of this enterprise repair and maintain all the landscaping around all the street signs, a number of street signs in the town along Route 6. And while that is perhaps an important endeavor, it has very little, if anything, to do with the cultivation or the distribution or the retail of cannabis. And so I think that is why this host community agreement piece is so important. By putting guardrails and oversight by the Cannabis Control Commission, we're going to be able to ensure that there is consistency and fairness here. And then the second piece I want to speak to briefly is related to social consumption. So social consumption is already the law in Massachusetts. In Chapter 94G, Section 4B1, allows social consumption licenses to occur with the consent of the towns. What we've needed to do here, and what the bill is really doing, is allowing municipalities to authorize social consumption through bylaw as an alternative to a referenda. Referenda is something that we don't do often at the municipal level in Massachusetts. And really this is about needing legal public locations for adults to consume cannabis in communities that want to have social consumption. So the reality in representing coastal communities that people visit, you heard my friend from Jamaica Plain talk about the real need for people who live in public housing or In other spaces where in their home cannabis consumption may be restricted, particularly those people who need it for medical use. The challenge we've had on the Cape and the islands is that this is a place where people come ashore. You take that is purchased legally. And this is only in communities that want to have this. So I also feel that social consumption is another way that we further can enable small-scale enterprises to participate into this industry, which was a priority in 2017 and clearly remains a priority today. We have work to do. So I'm delighted that we're debating this bill today. I want to thank all my colleagues and their terrific work to get us here to this point. And I look forward to voting in favor of the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes. After which we'll go into the amendments. I say that we are not working well yet, so Senate will return to recess. Senate will be in a brief recess.
Amendment number 1 by Mr. Gomez, ensuring equitable access to cannabis expungement.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Hamden, Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Through you and to the members, I rise today to support an amendment I filed, in amendment number 1, ensuring the equitable access to cannabis expungement. This amendment is a redraft of a bill that I filed this session, S-1048, an act ensuring equitable access to cannabis-related expungement, which remains under review by the Joint Committee of Judiciary. In summary, this amendment allows for the expungement of one's records if the decriminalized offense was for possession of marijuana, and further maintains the existing 6 grounds in statute for expungement. Further, the amendment provides that expungement will not be automatic and will require a petitioner to go through a hearing process. If the expungement order is ultimately granted, certified, and copies of the pertinent documents must be forwarded to the petitioner and the applicable police department, it's important to note that adding said this new provision will not preclude the post-judgment relief. I filed this bill and this amendment today because of my own personal experience. I am proud and humbled to stand before you today as a state senator, but for the people in my shoes, what I have been able to accomplish is sometimes a far-out dream. When I was 17 years old, I was charged with a mandatory minimum and charged as an adult, which helped me catapult my career in working on criminal justice reform, and also helped me in my advocacy of when it comes to decriminalized marijuana and obviously expungement of marijuana crimes. It is unthinkable to me that in a state where voters legalize marijuana, that we are still fighting at a legislative level to expunge these decriminalized offenses. Passing today's amendment means giving hope to many across the Commonwealth. It would allow people to be more easily to obtain jobs, attend higher education. Like myself, when I was charged, I lost my financial aid. It leases to lease apartments, and would also reaffirm the choice that Massachusetts voters made years ago on the ballot question. Thank you, Mr. President, for hearing me speak today, and thank you to Senator Eldridge for your steadfast support on this amendment as a chair of Judiciary, and Senator Lewis's support, and on the work on this issue as well. I hope that sharing my story has an impact and urges you all to support this amendment issue. I hope to see this amendment adopted in today's debate. Thank you so much.
Question amendment. You know what? If you're going to speak, we're going to take a little brief recess. I'm sorry. We'll take a brief recess for audio. Number 1, offered by the senator from Hamden, Mr. Gomez. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Middlesex and Worcester, Mr. Eldridge.
Mr. President, through you to the members, and I rise in support of the gentleman from Springfield's amendment number 1, ensuring equitable access to cannabis expungement. And I want to thank him for his leadership and also his courage in telling his personal story. The amendment before us is a bill that is still in the Judiciary Committee that I'm proud to chair, and I'm extremely supportive of adding this amendment to this legislation. I want to thank the Senate President. I want to thank the Senate Chair of Ways and Means, and of course the lady from Jamaica Plain, the Senate Chair of the Committee on Cannabis Policy, for their incredible leadership on a bill, not only to make sure that a relatively new industry is expanding, but obviously to make sure that every single person has access to engaging in this industry. And I would say that this amendment is another signal that this bill is not just about social equity, it's not just about supporting an industry, but it's another element of criminal justice reform, which I was proud to play a small role in 2018. Of course, Mr. President, one of the goals of legalizing cannabis was to create a cannabis industry that benefited the people who were the victims of the war on drugs in the era of mass incarceration, where I'm very happy to see we're finally ending and moving away from. And what this amendment would help make good on that promise. This amendment is focused directly on helping those who still have cannabis-related offenses on their criminal records that would not be crimes if committed today. There was very powerful testimony on this bill in the Judiciary Committee last year. And I want to highlight that the Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2018 attempted to address this issue, but unfortunately a well-intentioned provision in the law had two unintended consequences. And this amendment, again by the gentleman from Springfield, proposes to fix that. First, this amendment would change the language from may to shall for trial court judges in terms of trial court judges' discretion, where a district attorney is advocating, it has filed a motion to ascending to an expungement motion. So that's really critical to make sure that once someone has petitioned the court to have their record related to cannabis expunged, that we are moving from may to shall in this amendment. And secondly, Mr. President, this amendment would allow for expungement for what is essentially the sharing of cannabis among friends. Sharing small amounts of cannabis among friends is, of course, is now criminalized. That should be reflected in how the criminal justice system treats expungement. And so this is a critical amendment, again, that advances criminal justice reform, that has a direct impact disproportionately on people of color and working class communities, and ensures that people who have committed marijuana offenses that are now decriminalized can have clean records. So I join the gentleman from Springfield as well as the gentleman from Winchester in advocating for this amendment and urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. So it will now be in recess, subject to the call of the chair. This is for the purpose of the allowing people to participate if they wish to in the press conference, and just not multitasking in this space. So the press conference for the energy bill is being held in the reading room, and we'll be in recess until that is over, and that may be 45 minutes to an hour. Turn to what is now going to be a brief recess. We'll read.
Amendment number 2 by Mr. Gomez. Cannabis Social Equity Trust Fund Accountability.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Essex and Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. President, and through you to the members. I know that the gentleman from Hampton who offers us this amendment has some written materials that he is paging through at the moment, and I know that there is lots of good information in those pages, and I'm hoping that he will give us a brief explanation of the amendment that now pens before the Senate.
Thank you.
From Hampton.
The question from the gentleman from Gloucester. Thank you, Mr. President. Through you and to the members today, I rise in support of an amendment I filed, Amendment Number 2, Cannabis Social Equity Trust Fund Accountability. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we have heard from residents and advocates to call for to be spent equitably throughout the Commonwealth to ensure that funding was being spent in communities that needed it most. While today's legislation is not related to COVID-19 relief, the amendment I filed echoes that call for constituents in all of our districts. This amendment is simple. It requires that the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, in collaboration with the new Cannabis Social Equity Trust Fund Board, to file an annual report at the end of each fiscal year. That report is in detail how funds from the Social Equity Trust Fund were spent, where the funding was spent, and what entities, the goal of this said report is to ensure that funds from this new trust fund are truly being spent on entrepreneurs from communities that have been disproportionately harmed by marijuana prohibition and enforcement policies. The report shall be filed with the legislature as well as the State Auditor's Office and the Cannabis Control Commission. Further, the report to be made available is online for public review. In sum, this report will provide a blanket of accountability. Thank you for hearing me speak today. I hope that this amendment is adopted.
Present adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Amendment number 3 is on hold. The Senate will be in a brief recess.
The senator from 2nd Suffolk Middlesex has an amendment that the clerk will read.
Amendment number 4 by Mr. Brownsberger, removing barriers to employment.
The senator from 2nd Suffolk and Middlesex, Mr. Brownsberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment would clarify that a criminal conviction is not a per se bar to employment in a marijuana establishment. There is no prohibition, or there's no per se prohibition on having a criminal record to be an employee in an alcohol establishment. And this would make clear that there should be no prohibition, per se prohibition, on having a criminal record to work in a marijuana establishment. We are still maintaining the high standards of lack of a criminal record, substantial lack of a criminal record for the licensee, the operator, owner of the establishment. But for the employees, this would make clear that there should be that a criminal record should be no bar to employment. And I do believe that I've heard from people in the business that this is a significant barrier to bringing employees that need to come in from an equity standpoint. And so I hope the amendment is adopted.
The senator from, give me a minute here, 2nd Suffolk, Ms. Chang Diaz.
I just wanted to briefly rise and give thanks to the gentleman from Belmont. This amendment is a great example of the ways that the membership today is really bringing improvement to this bill, squarely in keeping with the overall goals of this legislation of increasing equity in the industry and economic empowerment and access in a broader way in our state. So I'm grateful to the gentleman for offering this amendment. It's great content. I hope the amendment passes.
Question comes on adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Senator from 2nd Middlesex has an amendment that the clerk will read. Excuse me. Number 5 is on hold. Number 6, same senator has an amendment which the clerk will read.
Amendment number 6 by Ms. Jalen, social equity businesses.
The senator from 1st Essex and Middlesex, Mr. Tarr.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you to the members, I move the Senate be in a brief recess.
Middlesex, Ms. Jalen.
Madam President, I just wanted to explain that this amendment clarifies that all types of marijuana establishments can apply for grants from the Social Equity Fund and can receive them. Just that it's applicable to all the different kinds of entities that exist and will exist in the Commonwealth. Thank you, Madam President.
Council adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. For the edification of the members, the following amendments have been withdrawn: 12, 13, 14, 17, and 29. Senator moving on to Amendment 7. Senator from 2nd Worcester, Mr. Moore, has an amendment that the clerk shall read.
Amendment number 7 by Mr. Moore, setting a time frame for host community agreement review.
Senator from 2nd Worcester, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam President. The Cannabis Control Commission to review and approve all host community agreements before initial licensure and at each renewal. As currently drafted, the legislation provides no timeline for the CCC to complete their evaluation of the host community agreement. This amendment would set a 120-day window for the CCC to review the host community agreement. This amendment will help manage expectations for all parties involved and enable planning between applicants and the communities on when they can expect a decision on their agreement from the CCC. Without this amendment, there is no timeline for how long the CCC can take and review an agreement. I ask for your support in the passage of this amendment. Thank you.
Question comes on adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Same senator has an amendment which the clerk will read.
Amendment number 8 by Mr. Moore, clarifying that host community agreements are required unless expressly waived.
The senator from 2nd Worcester, Mr. Moore.
Madam President, this amendment clarifies what happens after a host community agreement lapses by setting out 3 options. Those options are either the agreement can be either renewed, it can be renegotiated, or expressly waived by the parties in writing. The intent of the amendment is to avoid any situation where a host community agreement expires and through inaction is not replaced, but the parties have not expressly waived the host community agreement. The goal is to make clear that there needs to be a host community agreement in place unless the parties choose to waive the host community agreement in writing. I ask for passage of this amendment. Thank you.
All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Moving on to Amendment 10. The senator from 1st Essex and Middlesex has an amendment the clerk will read.
Amendment number 10 by Mr. Tarr, expanding the open container law to ensure safety on the roads of the Commonwealth.
From 1st Essex and Middlesex, Mr. Tarr.
Madam President, and through you to the members. Madam President, throughout the debate that's occurred in the Commonwealth, both in legislative chambers and in the public discussion surrounding the ballot initiative, we heard time and again the analogy cited that we ought to treat the regulation of marijuana in the same way that we treat the regulation of alcohol. And in fact, my good friend from Belmont used that analogy just a few moments ago in advocating for his successful amendment. And yet, Madam President, there are very notable instances when that has not been the case. And this amendment speaks to one of those relative to the issue of open containers, which is a matter directly related to public safety on the operation of motor vehicles on the roadways of the Commonwealth. And so it's a very easy discrepancy to understand, Madam President, because if you are operating a motor vehicle with an open container of alcohol in the passenger compartment of the vehicle, that is specifically prohibited, and there are specific criminal sanctions for that. But yet, Madam President, you can conduct the same behavior with regard to open containers of marijuana, and there is no similar provision. And I can see folks around the chamber looking at this. I know that others have worked on this issue as well, and yet, Madam President, we have not gotten to the point where we need to be. Now, Madam President, there's an ongoing discussion, and I appreciate that discussion that is happening right now with the Committee on Ways and Means and others in the chamber about how to best address this in the context of this particular bill. And as a result of that discussion and in consideration of it, I'm going to move that this amendment be held so that we can continue to try to find the appropriate way to address this in the context of this bill.
Moving on to Amendment 15, the senator from 2nd Hamden in Hampshire has an amendment the clerk will read.
And amendment number 15 by Mr. Vilas, host community agreements.
Brief recess.
Thank you, Madam President, and through you to the members. I rise today in support of this amendment, which will ensure that our municipalities and the prospective cannabis businesses looking to reside in them have the resources necessary to work with the Cannabis Control Commission to create appropriate host community agreements. For so many municipalities in our Commonwealth, but especially for smaller communities throughout the Commonwealth, many of which are in Western Massachusetts, these contracts with cannabis businesses are a critical source of revenue. With the new oversight given to the CCC over host community agreements in this bill, it's important that our municipalities remain a part of that process. After all, it is in these communities where the cannabis establishments themselves will reside. This amendment will ensure that our municipalities have the information they need to get their contracts across the finish line and get this new revenue into their communities. This amendment would require that the CCC develop a model host community agreement to serve as guidance for municipalities and prospective cannabis licenses. This model will be an important example that can be referred to throughout the entire process to help municipalities and businesses understand what the CCC is looking for and to make any changes to HCA requirements abundantly clear. In addition, this amendment would require that if the CCC does reject a host community agreement, that they must provide written notice to the municipality and the prospective cannabis license of what criteria was not met. This piece will help ensure that our municipalities can quickly and effectively address any deficiencies in their contracts and submit a revised agreement. The last thing our communities need is to lose out on potential revenue because of a small error in their host community agreement or because information was not efficiently communicated to them by the CCC. As we continue to work on this legislation, it is absolutely critical and important that we remember how important these businesses are to our municipalities and, in turn, how important it is for us to support our municipalities in this process. I therefore respectfully ask this amendment be adopted. Thank you, Madam President.
Question comes on amendment of the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The amendment is adopted. For the edification of the members, Amendment 11 has been withdrawn. The clerk, Senator from 1st Essex and Middlesex has an amendment the clerk will read.
Amendment number 18 by Mr. Tarr, implied consent to ensure safety on the roads of the Commonwealth.
The senator from 1st Essex and Middlesex, Mr. Tarr.
Madam President, and I appreciate your visible expression of enthusiasm for this particular amendment and appreciate you recognizing me to speak about it so that I can hopefully further enrich your appreciation of this particular amendment. Madam President, as I mentioned already, there had been numerous parallels drawn and have been numerous parallels drawn between alcohol and marijuana when it comes to the regulation of both substances, and yet we continue to see a disparity, particularly when it comes to the safe operation of motor vehicles on the roadways of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And Madam President, I note that the Cannabis Control Commission took specific note of this on March 11th, just a short while ago, Madam President. I know that you might have been watching this hearing remotely, but the Commission sent a letter to our Senate President and to the Speaker of the House, and in pertinent part, that letter reads, "The Commission supports legislation that strengthens laws against the operation of motor vehicles while under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs." Let me repeat that, Madam President, because there was a little bit of background noise here that I think was certainly unintentional. But, Madam President, in this letter, which was written to us on March 11th, 2022, the Commission wrote, "The Commission supports legislation that strengthens laws against the operation of motor vehicles while under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs. The Commission further supports legislation that protects civil rights, racial justice, data collection on gender and race, that ensures equitable enforcement of the law and advances in science-based technology needed to accurately assess cannabis impairment. Madam President, I would point out, and I think you're aware of this because I think you were watching this hearing remotely, but Madam President, this statement was endorsed unanimously by the Cannabis Control Commission. So the folks that we have charged with overseeing the issues related to, all issues related to cannabis in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have made a strong statement on the record that we should be pursuing strengthening the laws and doing it in an equitable and fair manner. And Madam President, that is exactly the subject of Amendment number 18, which is to say that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, if you get on a roadway and you're operating a motor vehicle and you are doing so under the influence of alcohol and you happen to be stopped while in that act, you are subject to the doctrine of implied consent. That is to say that in order to receive the privilege of operating that motor vehicle on the public roadways of the Commonwealth, you have constructively given consent to be tested for the presence of alcohol in your bloodstream in a variety of ways and through a variety of tests. And yet, Madam President, if you commit that same act of jeopardizing folks on the Commonwealth in the roadways by operating under the impairment of marijuana as opposed to alcohol, there is not the notion of implied consent, and you can do so with impunity without any thought, Madam President, that you will be subject to any kind of a test, a chemical test. You can certainly be subject to field sobriety tests, but you cannot be subject to a definitive test. And Madam President, you can blithely ignore a request to have those tests undertaken. Now, I know, Madam President, that there is a difference in the kinds of tests that are applicable here. There is no similar test for the presence of marijuana to the presence of alcohol as we would have with the breathalyzer machine. We're told those tests are in development, but they do not exist now. But in the meantime, Madam President, we have this dichotomy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where if you're operating a motor vehicle and you're impaired by virtue of consumption of one substance, you are treated in one way, and if you are operating a motor vehicle impaired by the consumption of another substance, you are treated in a different way, which is, Madam President, completely and wholly contradictory to the arguments that are made throughout about the legalization of marijuana, that it should be treated in the same way as alcohol. And now, if we attribute to the makers of those comments the kind of sincerity that we should, then clearly they would want this gap to be addressed, as we all should want the gap to be addressed, so that we don't have this dual nature of the law in the Commonwealth. And in fact, Madam President, I hearken back to the words sent to us on March 11th of 2022, where the Commission, the Cannabis Control Commission, in addition to many other things, say that there should be fair, equitable enforcement of the law. And they say that in the context of alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs. So the Cannabis Control Commission unanimously says that there should be equitable enforcement in a variety of contexts, but one of those contexts is alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs. So the folks that we charge with dealing with this issue every single day, who spend considerable amount of time and energy researching issues and opining on issues, have made the statement that we need to align our laws to be fair across the spectrum of substances. This amendment would do precisely that. So I would hope that it would have unanimous support. But Madam President, like a prior amendment on a similar subject, we are having an ongoing conversation relative to this one, and I would move that the amendment be placed on hold so that we can try to reach a path forward on this, Madam President, which I know would delight you. And it would delight me as well. So I move that the amendment be placed on hold.
Amendment number 18 is on hold. The next Amendment 19 is on hold. We're moving to Amendment 20. The senator from First Essex and Middlesex has an amendment that the clerk will read.
Amendment number 20 by Mr. Tarr, ensuring voter participation.
The senator from First Essex and Middlesex, Mr. Tarr.
Thank you, Madam President, and it's just wonderful to see your enthusiasm in presiding today, and I want to thank you for it. It adds a lot to the chamber. So, Madam President, this particular amendment has to do with ensuring that the public has the most maximum possible role that it can in the adoption by local communities at local option around on-premises consumption. Madam President, the bill that now pens before the Senate suggests that, as is currently the case, those kind of decisions must be made by a public referendum. But in addition to that, in the bill that pens before the Senate, there would be by a public referendum. But in addition to that, in the bill that pens before the Senate, there would be authorized the creation of a local law or a local ordinance. Now, Madam President, while there still is public involvement in the creation of a local law or a local ordinance, we all know that that public participation is not to the same extent that there is in a referendum. Now, Madam President, one of the things that this amendment does that's very significant is add to the provisions that are in the current draft as proposed by the Committee on Ways and Means, which says that you can have a public initiative petition. This amendment also says that the governing body in a municipality, either the Board of Selectmen or the City Council, can on its own initiative place such a referendum before the public. But what it cannot do is avoid a public referendum on such an important question as on-premises consumption of marijuana. And so the amendment strikes the ability to create a parallel path of having an ordinance or a local law, but gives the local governing body the ability to use the same mechanism as the public would use, and would ensure that the voters have a full opportunity to weigh in on the question of on-premises consumption. So if you believe in democracy and if you believe in full participation and allowing every voter the opportunity to weigh in on such an important decision, and I believe most of us do, then obviously you would be supportive of this amendment. If you want to create a path that prevents that full public participation, then you would be against this amendment. So I hope the amendment is adopted, and I move that when a vote is taken on this matter, it be taken by a call of the yeas and nays.
Vote be taken by a call of the yeas and nays. Those in favor rise. Sufficient number have risen. When a vote is taken, it will be taken by a call of the yeas and nays. The senator from First Bristol and Plymouth. Oh, sorry. Senator from Second Suffolk, Ms. Chang-Diaz, sorry.
President, I rise in loving opposition to this amendment. The underlying bill that we have before us today would, as has been previously mentioned, allow local communities to opt in to permitting social consumption businesses by local ordinance, in addition to the existing possibility of doing so by local referendum. Permitting this to go through the local political process, this decision-making to go through the local political process, the same as all other town ordinances do, will both save municipal resources needed to execute a ballot question and avoid delays resulting from having to wait months or years until the next election cycle in some cases, while also maintaining accountability to the voters. The bill still permits a referendum if that is the way that the town wishes to go. Therefore, Madam President, I would ask my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Come to order. The senator from First Bristol and Plymouth, Mr. Rodrigues.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank the gentlelady from Jamaica Plain for her comments. I rise in support of her comments and asking members to please vote no on this amendment. You know, the 2016 ballot question was quite clear that if voters approve